David H. Morrison was awarded a Doctor of Philosophy degree from Princeton Theological Seminary in Theology in May 2024. His dissertation is entitled The Theologies of American Christian Nationalism. Prior to attending Princeton Seminary, David enjoyed a 23-year career in the federal government and serving for a brief period of time as the chair of the National Security and International Policy Practice at the Podesta Group. He also served as a key advisor to Speaker Nancy Pelosi on national security issues. David and his wife, Phoebe Novakovic, are the co-founders of the Morrison-Novakovic Faith and Public Policy Center at Davis and Elkins College. The center is a living learning community focused on the intersection of faith, social issues, and public policy. Joining David today is award-winning journalist Nadine Epstein. Nadine is editor-in-chief and CEO of Moment magazine and the founder and executive director of the Center for Creative Change. Please welcome David H. Morrison and Nadine Epstein.
I'm so pleased to have David Morrison with me today so that we can take a deep dive into Christian nationalism and its connection to anti-Semitism in the United States. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Nadine, thanks for having me. It's good to see you.
So I wanted to start like way back in the Argent times. There's, the belief in a separation of church and state is fundamental to the United States. There was Roger Williams, who's the Puritan minister who founded Providence, Rhode Island. And he believed in a high wall between church and state to protect people's freedom and conscience and salvation. And then there was Thomas Jefferson, and there was James Madison, who both shared this belief that state support for a particular religion was improper. But yet there's always been those in the United States historically who did argue for a Christian state and for Christian supremacy. And I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit about them.
Sure. Thanks for the question. It's interesting you mentioned Roger Williams and his Puritan background. Puritanism actually provided the core theological ideas and ideology about the Christian possibilities of America as a new nation. That, along with the Great Awakening led by Jonathan Edwards, which was more of a popular movement that spurred passion. The theological ideas came, and the theocratic ideas came out of Puritanism. So, whereas Williams went one way, there are a number of other very powerful voices, very powerful clerical voices in the period leading up to the revolution that believed and advocated for several things. The first was that the rebellion against the English against the English motherland, Nadine, was in fact God's call. And so you'll see language in many of the major sermons offered at that time indicating that the cause of America was God's cause. They were one and the same. So the idea of liberty, originally a Puritan idea of religious liberty when they fled England in order to be able to practice religious freedom, which is basically the liberal basis of the idea behind church and state, right? A liberal concept. The Puritan concept was a religious liberty that harkened back to the days of Exodus and Moses leading his people out of freedom, based being guided by the hand of God. So that's first. The second thing is the idea that what God had called America to was to become a Christian republic. Now, interestingly, this was not just clerics who were making this claim. People like Benjamin Rush a signer of the Declaration of Independence, believed that the best form of government was a Republican government and that it would be guided by Christian morals. So what Rush did was he was able to transform, Rush and others, but he's the sort of the prototype, was able to transform this idea of creating a separate country that had originally was destined, had a millennial destiny to become the new Israel, into the idea that this would become a liberal republic based on Christian and moral values. So that strain is the strain that has obtained throughout our American history. Now, of course, Jefferson and Madison were very careful about this. And the reason is because they have in their hindsight, as did Locke, to a lesser extent Hobbes, to some extent Rousseau, all of these Enlightenment ideas about the care the polity should take with its treatment of religion was, of course, the religious wars of the early 1600s. So that liberal idea, liberal small l, that promoted individual human rights as natural, Declaration of Independence and the Constitution reference God, but they do so. That's more of a sop than anything else. The basic idea is, as you well know, human rights are natural rights, and so the liberal idea was to embrace that and try and keep at bay the religious overtones that would, in Madison's view, create terrible factions, and it would deny freedoms and rights to those folks who weren't as religious as, say, Samuel Sherwood or Abraham Cateltus or even John Witherspoon.
Let me just pop in for 1 second. So
Please.
basically, we have the conflict that we see today has its origins in a much earlier time.
Indeed.
Although, obviously, Jefferson and Madison, won that battle, or at least appeared to won that battle on paper on the Declaration of Independence.
Yeah.
And so, one of my next questions really is, how did this concept of, how did the Christian nationalism or the Christian supremacy, how did that get entangled, and when did that get entangled with white supremacy?
I think it was certainly in the origins of the American nation. America was born. American nationalism was an ethno-religious nationalism. The ethnicity, of course, was Anglo-Saxon. The religious aspect was Protestantism, in particular Calvinism. So the birth of American nationalism was coincident with the birth of American Christian nationalism. They were tied at the hip. And the reason this is, Nadine, is nationalism is a political ideology with a cultural core. Nationalism has three goals. It tries to unify the country, the nation. It strives to keep it autonomous. Those are the political goals. The cultural, sociological goals are to create a national identity. So America's national identity, to start with, was white, Anglo-Saxon Protestant, and small l, liberal - Republican. That was the political ideology. So it's woven into our DNA. What excites those things into liberal values of inclusiveness, open-mindedness, or contrary to those, exclusivist, ethno-linguistic, which was sort of the basis for some of the more horrific nationalisms we see in the 20th century, is fear. And it's fear of a loss of place and power. So when we see white supremacy, then in the Ku Klux Klan, now in some forms of Christian nationalism, they claim that their ideas of whiteness, of racist white supremacy, is biblically based. It finds its origin in the United States of America. So they quote freely from the Bible, and they quote freely from the founding documents of the United States of America. It's a reinterpretation of history, of course. That's not what most people would think would be a decent Christian ethics, but it's there for the taking. So, and it gets excited by fear of loss, crisis, significant demographic shifts, influx. We see these things rise and fall with changes in demographic patterns, influxes of immigrants from different parts of the world. Strange, and I put that in quotes, to what people were used to here in the United States of America. You see it at the end of the 19th century, at the beginning of the 20th century. You see it rise again with the culture wars starting in the late 1960s and early 70s. And it's largely driven by fear and a corrupt ideology that reinterprets the history of the United States of America.
Okay, we're going to come back to how it's impacting us today. But
right.
Let me just ask another kind of background question here, which is really, when does anti-Semitism, which is obviously one of the oldest prejudices and tropes that exists, when does anti-Semitism and white supremacism become entangled in the United States?
It's always been latent. Anti-Semitism is a disposition, a mental attitude, a psychology that has been embedded in and part of the culture of Christianity, and so too Islam and some of the other major religions. That's the first thing. It's a latent strain found within certain practices and praxes and theologies of Christianity. So it is anti-Semitism is excited, just like racism, ethnocentrism, and ugly forms of nationalism, again, by fear. These things go together, and they manifest this fear, these sort of aggressive, violence in its broadest sense, Nadine. The ideologies, their aim is to blame. Their aim is to depersonalize and dehumanize. And sadly, world history has seen Jewish populations and groups subject to that form of blame, because it's just it takes a group and it dehumanizes them. All of a sudden, these are not persons. They become problems. They become means to a political ideology, and so anti-Semitism, racism, xenophobia, all of these things go together, and they tend to travel in a very ugly, tattered basket. That is convenient in some ways, because it's easy to blame people at that point.
Well, my colleague Eric Ward, who I host the Wide River Project with, he he argues that anti-Semitism is actually at the core of white supremacism,
Yeah.
including racism. And I was wondering what you think about that.
Um, I think that I don't quite see it that way. But as I just mentioned, I think these things travel together. I think racism, anti-Semitism is all part of a broader narrative designed to dehumanize people for some sort of political ideology.
Okay.
You can see, you know, I think Eric's claims are probably closer to the truth the more Christian, quote unquote Christian, a white supremacist movement claims to be, or actually exhibits. Because of course, I mean, these are, as I said just a bit ago, there are numerous cultural Christian theologies and Christian cultural praxis that dehumanize the Hebrew population, and it's a paradox. We embrace the Hebrew scriptures. We embrace the Hebrew nation. We embrace the Israel nation and its historical and political development as part of the Christian salvific and sacred history. Yet,
That's a big yet.
yes, it is.
So I want to dive a little bit into, we talk about Christian nationalism, and it's such a broad term, and it's certainly not a monolithic group.
Right.
There's so many, and this is not confined to one branch of Christianity.
Right.
And I was wondering if we could just start out, like, is there one particular branch that you would consider more white supremacist than others?
Yes, indeed. I think Christian nationalism has evolved as American Christian nationalism. I'll talk about that because that's basically what I know. American Christian nationalism has evolved as the country evolved. And it took basically two different paths. And I'll describe those in a second. But I will make this claim. I think there are good forms and bad forms of American Christian nationalism. I think we could consider Martin Luther King Jr. a good American Christian nationalist. Obviously, I think the Ku Klux Klan and I think the most prevalent form of American Christian nationalism today are bad forms. The bad forms are reactionary, exclusivist, idolatrous, driven by an anger and fear intent on polarizing and dehumanizing. They see Christianity and use Christianity as a membership card, so that anyone falling outside a particular form of Christianity, in both cases, a very conservative evangelical form, a new for evangelical. The original term of evangelical was actually positive. Today we use it as a pejorative. And so I'll use it as some people do today. Evangelical, really the better term, Nadine, is fundamentalist, a more conservative fundamentalist strain of Christianity that has always seen itself as being constrained, under threat by the more powerful and prevalent forms of Christianity in America. So once again, the bad forms of American Christian nationalism intent on securing their place and what they believe is their rightful due based on American history. They see the world in black and white. They define the world in terms of us versus them, contrary to the liberal small l nationalism, and in this case Christian nationalism, that Martin Luther King Jr. practiced, that that people in the social gospel practice, like Walter Rauschenbusch, although he had some difficulties with Semitism. I mean, he was on the edge. In fact, some people would refer
I actually
to.
don't know who he is. Can you tell us
Yeah, Walter
who he is?
Rauschenbusch was one of
Yeah.
the theological leaders of the social gospel at the turn of the century, 1800s to 1900s. A Lutheran, German heritage. He actually worked in Hell's Kitchen. So that's where he pastored, and then he became a theologian. He was at Rochester Seminary. Um, he basically wrote the theology behind the social gospel. He's been accused of being a racist, but I think a thoroughgoing analysis of his work would prove otherwise. Yet, along with that, along with those claims of race of being racist, he was also accused of anti-Semitism.
So are there some denominations within fundamental Christianity or evangelical Christianity that are, that are more, that we should be more concerned about than others?
Um,
Because there's so many different kinds of, fundamental Christians. So
there are a couple different ways to think about fundamentalist Christianity in America. You have sort of the organized, denominational based Christian groups. And then you have the Pentecostals and the holiness sects who really don't claim any denominational status or affiliation. They tend to be non-denominational. So the major fundamentalist or quasi-fundamentalist denominations in America, of course, are the Southern Baptist Convention. That's actually the largest denomination in America. This is the denomination that Russell Moore left. Russell Moore was the political director of the Southern Baptist Conference Convention for years, and he left because of their affiliations with Donald Trump. And he laments, along with other folks, Michael Herson, he laments the turn of evangelical or fundamentalist Christianity to Donald Trump and their embrace of the far right's polarization of American politics and all that came with it. Now, the fundamentalists and the holiness and Pentecostal sects are strong, strict Calvinists, and they don't admit of any other form of Christianity or other religion as a result of that. And so
well, what does it mean to be a strict Calvinist? Yeah, tell us a little bit.
Calvinist, Calvin has been Calvin and Calvinism has been accused of being morally rigid, theologically conservative. It holds dear to the ideas that human beings are predetermined to be saved or to be sinners. This is predestination. They are elected by God before we're even born. This is what's known as the doctrine of election and predestination. That doctrine in particular has been used by strict Calvinists as a form of dehumanizing and depersonalizing. Either you're in or you're out. And so strict Calvinists, very morally rigid, highly swayed by the idea that God has chosen good Christians and everybody else are sinners and will go to hell. And those determinations, unfortunately, are made by the people who believe that the strongest. So it's a very conservative theology, and anything that smacks of liberal thinking, anything that smacks of diversity and inclusion, it is seen to be undermining Christian precepts, in particular their moral
And
and theological
and where
ideas.
do we see this Calvinist influence today? In which denominations on the
Calvinism is through almost all the Protestant mainline and conservative denominations, with the exception of Lutheranism, right? Lutherans. So Calvinism is the dominant form of Protestantism in America. It was originally an evangelical religion. Evangelical meaning, in this case, it was neutral, not politically oriented, to spread the good news. And the founders were all Calvinists, most of them, the religious founders. And they were, in fact, they were all Presbyterians, Congregationalists / Puritans, and Northern Baptists. And they all sort of softened the Calvin edge in order to meld it with, liberal Republican political ideology to come up with American Christian nationalism. But as time went on, again, fear, crisis, loss of power and place drove some denominations to accept a strict Calvinism in order to protect their sense of power and worth in America.
So how is that playing out in politics today?
Oh, wow. So you've seen an ascendancy really since the 1980s with the moral majority, late 70s, early 80s, and the embrace of fundamentalist evangelical Christianity by the Republican Party, as to counter what they believe to be the undermining of American values, undermining of Christian values by the late 60s, early 70s counterculture movements. So it's people will argue about the extent to which, even the definition of culture war, but we'll submit that it is true. And so the culture wars have featured a religious angle to it. The Republican Party.
Jews are perceived to be as being on the other side of the culture war.
Who, me?
Jews are perceived often
Well,
as being on the other side of the culture war.
indeed. And that's part of the issue with anti-Semitism today from the right, okay, and from the left. But we'll get there to that later. So the Republican Party was quite adept at using the churches and using pastors to gin up political passions and political support. The Democrats, on the other hand, were not, and they chose not to be. So you'll see that today. The religious splits among parties are on the right-hand side. You have people who are conservative political ideologies associated with evangelical fundamental Christian denominations and sects, and on the left and the Democrat side, you'll see that the largest denomination in liberal left politics are those who don't have any denomination at all.
Or there's one, I think, exception to that. And I think that's the kind of, there certainly were a number of more liberal Black churches that I think have been an important part of the Democratic Party political machine.
I think that's true. That's a very good point. The mainline churches, what I mean by the mainline denominations, Presbyterian, Lutheran, United Church of Christ, Northern Baptists are the big ones, Methodists. They have actually, since the late 60s and 70s, they have begun to lose numbers of congregants and members. And they started falling off the cliff in the early 2000s, so that they lost basically about half of their membership during that time. So with those denominations were once the most powerful politically, especially during the 30s, 40s, 50s, and even up into the early 60s. They have lost a considerable amount of political power. And they lament the fact that the political Christian right has ascended.
Well, let's just take a pause on the Protestant side for a second,
Right.
and let's pop over to Catholicism, because certainly there's a certain strain of Catholicism that's now a very conservative strain of Catholicism that's come to the forefront, and we see that in the Supreme Court,
Right.
where almost, with one exception, all the Catholic members, of which are the majority, are part of the more conservative strains. And I'm wondering if, how does white supremacism fit in, and anti-Semitism fit in the Catholic side?
It's certainly not as pronounced as you find it on the Protestant fundamentalist side.
Did Vatican II change some of that? Although
I think so. I think that's well said. I think there's another reason why, Nadine. The Catholic Church, as it grew in America, had as much, if not more, a strong sense of social justice baked into its theology and its praxis. Many of the social justice leaders in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and even up to the 60s came out of the Catholic Church. Dorothy Day, John Courtney Murray, these folks. And so I think in many ways Vatican II was an acceptance of that long tradition and a promotion of that long tradition. Nonetheless, as you point out, there are conservative strains of Catholicism, and it's based on a conservative theology that upholds ideas of right to life and other political ideas based on a fairly strict understanding of the natural law tradition that comes out of Aquinas. And so the preservation of life is number one. That's the first of the natural laws, and that sort of guides quite a lot of conservative Catholic thought. Do I think that there are this new strain of conservative Catholicism is white supremacist? I don't get that sense. But what I do get the sense is they sort of buy in to the idea, once again, of a mentality of us versus them. And everything that comes with that whole basket of polarizing thoughts and attitudes.
So they become part of the culture. They're on one side of the culture war.
They are, but I think
they're on the conservative side of the culture war, even though they may not buy into all the anti-Semitic.
I think that's right. I think that's right.
Well, let's pop over. Let's talk about Israel. Well, actually, before we talk about Israel, let's talk about the left. So there's also the Christian left, and there seems to be, as we've seen, some latent anti-Semitism within these communities as well. And I thought, could you tell us a little bit more about that?
Yes, thanks. There's not much of the Christian left anymore. Mostly they're Christian purple churches.
What does that mean, Christian purple churches?
It's a blend of conservative and liberal ideological affiliations and political party affiliations.
Okay.
I think on the Christian left, it has been true of the Christian left since the founding of the United States that there's a significant academic and intellectual side to it. You'll find that in some of the major more liberal denominations such as Presbyterianism and Congregationalism, now known as the United Church of Christ. They value education more so, I think, than what you would find in some of the other denominations. As a result of that, Nadine, they can be, the Christian left can be captured by cultural and social justice issues, academic trends, academic fads, and I don't use that term pejoratively. You know, academic thinking ebbs and flows just like any other cultural phenomenon. And so I think the Christian left has been captured by the things that have captured the secular political left, in particular critical theory and the whole deconstructionist thinking that has attended to that, as well as the whole lens framework of looking at things in a colonial, decolonialist, imperial, anti-imperialist lens. That's the fundamental problem on the Christian left. If it is fundamental, maybe that's too strong. That it's a blend of the idea of social justice, which is strong on the Christian left, co-opted is too strong, shaped by ideas of critical theory and colonialist, decolonialist ideas. So you'll hear that language, that language has captured the Christian left, as much to align with the secular left, and the Christian left has always been willing to align itself with the secular left more so than the right has, except in the case of the moral majority and those folks who are interested in political power.
So let's talk about Israel now. So
yeah,
there's the fundamentalist Christian groups,
yeah,
and they have, and then there's the Christian left, the remaining Christian left that you talk about.
yeah.
How does Israel fit into their theology, their philosophies?
Yeah, that's a fascinating question. For both groups, it's paradoxical. On the right, the fundamentalist, aggressive American Christian nationalists and denominations that feature that form of ideology, the paradox lies in this way. They embrace their heritage from the Israel nation and Israel history. It's part of salvation history. They embrace the ideas that Israel was the first nation. They embrace the idea that America was to be the new Jerusalem. That's the language that's used. The new Israel. That's the language that's used. And yet, Israel is not a Christian nation. Therefore, it's not part of us. It can never be part of us. However far us extends. So as a result of that, America, the more fundamentalist side, the sort of bad American Christian nationalism, are willing to use scriptural justifications for violence, for othering that you can find in the Hebrew scriptures, and particularly in Joshua and occasionally in the Psalms, as well as scriptural justifications for the fear of displacement, existential threats to the nation. And that's on the negative side. And on the positive side, they will trumpet the idea that God is calling them to do X, Y, or Z, to establish a Christian nation, and after that, to establish a Christian world. It's God's call. all of that, that leaves modern, modern Israel sort of out of the picture. Now we can talk about dispensationalism and that whole idea of millennialism, the idea that the world is awaiting Christ's return. And one of the signs and symbols of that will be a unified and strong Israel. But that is an idea you find in the book of Daniel, you find it in the New Testament, in the book of Revelation, allusions to all of these things. But Daniel is the big one. Hebrew scriptures as well, a Hebrew prophet of Israel. But I don't know that there's that level of sophistication in the American Christian national and conservative American Christian nationalism now, like there used to be. On the left-hand side, there's a paradox as well. They embrace the idea that Israel's history, its religious and political development, is part of the Christian salvation story. In fact, on the religious left, Christian left, we find analogies between the birth of the Israel nation, the growth in their moral and political development. We find analogies that in the New Testament as well.
Well, how does this translate into their actual support or lack of support, or actually anti-Israel positions on Israel today?
On the right, they're hamstrung by a Christian ideology that doesn't see that doesn't affirm the place of Israel in the development of the kingdom of God coming.
But yet I see, there are groups like, Christians United for Israel.
Right.
There are, when I traveled to Israel, there are many, Christian tour groups, or at least there were before October 7th.
Right.
There is a kind of, I get tons of emails from organizations
Right.
on the Christian right that are, saying that they support Israel. How does that translate? Yeah. So this is coming from this. This is coming because they used to be that people thought, well, they were supporting Israel because they thought, the rapture would occur and that would, but now, many of them say they don't believe that anymore. But they still support Israel. And of course, Israel itself has suddenly become part of the culture wars, or has evolved into becoming part of the culture wars.
Yeah. I think it's as much a political reaction as I think it's a religious reaction, to be honest with you.
Okay.
I think they buy into the idea that of American isolationism that you find on the right more and more these days. I think that's part of it. I also think that there's a general exhaustion over the issues of the Middle East, particularly on the right. They just don't want to have to deal with it anymore, Nadine. Now there's chest thumping and staunch protestations of staunch support for Israel, but when it comes right down to it, there's no money where their mouth is, in a sense.
Okay.
On the left, is troubled by a paradox. They embrace the idea of the Israel nation and nationhood as the forerunner for the model for America and its national character, and yet they are constrained by this colonialist decolonialist idea, and there are.
So let's talk about how the fundamentalist part of the Christian right
Yeah.
So how did it come to merge with MAGA? Or has it completely merged with MAGA? It appears to have, but
I think completely is strong. I think
okay.
I think it largely supports the MAGA movement and Mr. Trump for a couple of reasons. Um, uh, Trump's politics of fear play well with the fears, the abiding fears of these denominations and sects that have resided in their attitudes and their culture since the beginning of the United States of America. So they're attracted to the idea that people are coming to take their power in their place. And Mr. Trump is very good at exciting those fears and pointing them out. Second, the fundamentalist Christian movement is politically conservative. And so they're going to support Republicans, conservative issues, whoever's at the helm. Third, they have decided that character and morals don't matter,
Yes, I was gonna ask you
and
about that.
and they don't matter. It's politically expedient. They claim now that God forgives all people, and that's true. God does. But this is the reason that Russell Moore left the Southern Baptist Convention, because in particular, the Southern Baptist Convention was calling for Bill Clinton's head during the Monica Lewinsky thing, and they wrote a big treatise that was very popular that basically stated that morals matter in our leaders, and now they have completely walked away from that, and it's because they want political power, and it's politically expedient. They're willing to turn the Bible on its head, or at least reinterpret the Bible. At one time, the Bible said morals matter. Now it says God forgives. It actually says both. So they're manipulating the scriptures in order to justify a political position.
So how worried should we be in this upcoming presidential election about the role of really the fundamentalist Christian right?
The worry is there are two worries. I think the first worry is its willingness to embrace violence. We saw that on January 6th. We heard it from a number of church leaders leading up to January 6th. We see it in polls even today that majority of Republicans and certainly a majority of Christian nationalists who identify as Republican seem to believe that political violence is acceptable in order to obtain political power and keep opponents from having political power. That's the first thing I would say. The second thing I would say is the whole idea, the whole tendency to want to exclude people, to want to depersonalize people as a function of fear, particularly that we find on the right, is very troublesome. They'll be willing to embrace fringe groups. And in fact, a number of authors have written about the idea of political extreme and racial extremes, anti-Semitic extremes have become mainstreamed. And that's a cultural, social phenomenon. That's the cultural and social phenomenon tied to the political prospects of Mr. Trump that I worry about most. That in fact, extremist ideas will become mainstream, and we'll see all sorts of efforts to exclude people, to depersonalize people, to enforce a sort of strict, rigid morality that's not morality at all.
Haven't they already become mainstream in significant part of the country?
I think in pockets of the country they have, sure. I
Well,
don't want to characterize it as yet as being mainstream. They are becoming. I think there are still a fair amount of folks, institutions that are willing to resist this, at least for now.
Well, given the kind of anti-Semitism rise in anti-Semitism,
Yeah.
dramatic rise in anti-Semitism we've seen, and even violence against Jews,
Right.
and it's not only against Jews, but
Right.
we're talking about anti-Semitism right today.
Yeah.
I mean, what should Jews be? Should Jews be worried if we see, a Trump presidency, a second Trump presidency?
Well, you know the answer as well as I do to that.
Well, I want you to answer that.
Yes, I would be worried. I'd be worried more on the social and cultural side than I would on the political side. I think it's fairly clear to me, and this is true on both sides of the aisle, but more so on the Republican side than on the Democrat side. I don't think there's any doubt that our politics now feature a negative partisanship more than a positive partisanship. We want to vote against people as opposed to voting for people. It's also become a politics of blame, and the worry would be that should there be a loss or even a win, that people are going to be blamed. And when blame knows no boundaries, when people lose political power and are fearful about their place and influence in society. And so that's what I would worry about, both with a Republican win and a Republican loss, by the way. I think that it might even be worse. I think,
So,
and I want to say, and I say this with some trepidation, I'm not sure. I'm not sure that the liberal left, small L liberal left, and big L liberal left, have enough moral mettle mettle, mettle, to withstand it. It's the whole argument about the thinness of liberal morality. And in this case, I think it could be troublesome.
and what is that argument?
The argument is that the morality of liberalism is thin because it focuses on the individual. So it's atomized, it's morally relative in many ways, it's relativistic. And it rejects the idea of the importance of community and developing morals and ethics and cultural and social understandings and traditions that are all part of our moral and political makeup. So that's basically the argument, that liberalism is fundamentally flawed. I reject that argument. But
I was going to say there's definitely community, and there's even the social justice aspects. So it's much more complex. But I do hear that argument often.
Yeah. But the worry will be that here we'll see the thinness of liberal morality in the face of aggressive, violent, and it could be very violent. That's what I worry about. Violent tactics to undermine our country and shape our society and culture
So you're saying you're concerned that liberals with a capital L, small L, or won't be able, and a capital L, won't be able to stand up to the far right.
Yeah,
is what you're saying?
I worry about that
because they're so divided within themselves. And
yes, that's exactly right.
Okay. So one last question. I'm just wondering what can be done. We obviously have overt and less overt anti-Semitism within
Yeah.
the Christian right. What can be done to, change this? This has been a long evolution to get here, but is there hope that there, is there hope that we can that these
Yeah.
that this path might change? And what could we do?
I think there's always hope. I think that is a theological virtue along with faith and love. Martin Luther King Jr.'s the big text that has all of Martin Luther King Jr.'s most famous writings is called A Testament to Hope. So I always believe that there's hope. I think we have to come to grips with the idea in this country that we, on both the left and the right, that we're working to undermine our basic liberal freedoms. That's a big picture worry. I think the answer, I think that's the background. It's the thing that we have to recognize that we have done over the past 3, 4, 5, 6 decades. But I don't believe that there's a national solution to this, Nadine. I think it has to start in local communities. And I think the churches actually can be serve as models for decent, good public discourse. I think that this is what they need to do. I think churches that are unwilling to recognize that American Christian nationalism exists are putting their head in the sand. And I think that that's wrong. And I think as a result of it, they're unwilling to see or at least acknowledge the anti-racist, anti-Semitic characteristics of this Christian nationalism. If they're willing to say, well, there's no such thing as Christian nationalism, then they're unwilling to really grapple with all the depersonalizing and dehumanizing and fearful things that American Christian nationalism on the right is doing. We need to reject that. We need to accept the idea that there is a good form. There are good forms of American Christian nationalism, and it starts in the sanctuary. It starts with modeling good public discourse. That it has to be local solutions. It cannot be dictated from afar, I think. So that's where the hope lies. It
And
lies in the
how does that
partnerships of
happen?
it lies in partnerships with sanctuaries and synagogues, with white churches and black churches, right? With Latino Catholic sanctuaries and Tree of Life synagogues in Squirrel Hill, in Pittsburgh area, things like that. That's where it has to begin.
So it's rebuilding the interfaith movement, which hasn't completely gone, but strengthening the interfaith movement that
Agreed.
could
Yeah.
make a huge difference.
Yeah. And we have to recognize, like all ecumenical movements, is you're giving up something to get something. You may give up a bit of your identity, but in the process, you're going to get a greater identity. Is it going to be more diversified, more diverse, maybe a bit diluted from what it used to be? Sure. But that's the price to be paid for peace and friendship.
And in the process, you're also strengthening democracy from what you're saying.
Yes, ma'am. I believe that wholeheartedly.
Well, thank you very much for this
Thank
fascinating conversation. I know I brought you to many places and questions here, but thank you so much for joining us today, David.
I'm quite grateful for the time. And it's as you can see, I feel very strongly about some of these issues. And so I'm grateful for the opportunity to share them with you, my thoughts.